They pointed fingers. They laughed too loudly. They whispered with cruel smiles because the man standing quietly among them wore a simple suit and had skin they decided did not belong in a room built on privilege. In front of hundreds of polished executives and flashing cameras, he became their unspoken joke, the outsider they thought no one would ever defend. They mistook quiet dignity for weakness and arrogance for strength. They thought their world was untouchable. What they did not know was that their entire future was already slipping away with every insult they delivered. One man, silent and steady, was about to turn their perfect empire into rubble without ever raising his voice. Stay with me as we uncover a story of hidden power, public humiliation, and the kind of justice that no one saw coming. Make sure to like this video, subscribe for more, and comment where you are watching from and which moment struck you the most. The evening air inside the Marlowe Grand Ballroom was thick with ambition and polished pride. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in a soft golden glow, reflecting off sleek suits and shimmering dresses. Power brokers and innovators from across the industry mingled with practiced ease, every laugh calculated, every national weight of expectation. Richard Coleman stood in the center of it all, commanding attention like a king among courtiers. His tailored navy suit, gleaming cufflinks, and effortless confidence made him the axis around which the room turned. When he smiled, conversations paused. When he moved, paths cleared. It was his world, and tonight, he intended to remind everyone exactly who ruled it. Across the marble floor entered Marcus Reed, his presence understated yet dignified. He wore a charcoal gray suit, simple but impeccably clean, a statement of quiet self-assurance rather than a cry for attention. Unlike the ostentatious display of wealth around him, Marcus carried himself with a different kind of gravity, one that came not from needing to impress, but from knowing his worth. Richard's eyes narrowed the moment he noticed him. There was a subtle tightening at the corners of his mouth, an almost imperceptible shift in posture. He tilted his glass slightly, drawing the gaze of those around him toward Marcus. With a low chuckle, barely audible but deadly in its precision, Richard let out a pointed remark. "Looks like someone missed the memo on proper dress code tonight," he said, his voice carrying just enough to slice through the surrounding chatter. A ripple of laughter spread outward from his circle. Some executives smirked behind their glasses, others exchanged quick, knowing glances. The message was clear. Marcus was marked, set apart not for who he was, but for who they assumed he was not. Marcus caught the drift of the room, but remained composed. He responded with a slight nod, polite and unreadable, then moved towards the refreshment table without hesitation. If the jab wounded him, he gave no sign. His movements were steady, deliberate, immune to the social games unfolding around him. Yet the damage was done. Wherever he walked, conversations stumbled into awkward pauses, smiles stiffened and backs turned just slightly away. Invitations to private lounges and insider talks, offered freely to others, conveniently forgot to find their way to him. Richard, watching from across the room, sipped his champagne with thinly veiled amusement. He exchanged murmured words with Scott Evans, a senior director, both of them sharing a chuckle too sharp to be anything but cruel. Behind the scenes, a few younger employees shifted uneasily. Emma Brooks, an intern barely out of college, clutched her glass tighter as she witnessed the unfolding spectacle. She wanted to say something, anything, but the unspoken rule was clear. Speak up against Richard Coleman and your future would be over before it even began. The orchestra struck up a slow waltz, but Marcus remained on the periphery, sipping water and scanning the crowd with a calm detachment. He was not here for their approval. He was here to observe, to listen, to understand the culture that hid behind polished smiles and hollow words. Near the bar, Karen Wallace, another rising executive, leaned toward a colleague and muttered just loud enough, "Who lets the help wander around unsupervised?" The laughter that followed was hushed but sharp, another blade drawn quietly across the night. Through it all, Marcus remained an island unto himself. His composure seemed almost provocative to those who sought to diminish him. They mistook his silence for weakness. They mistook his patience for permission. They had no idea that each slight, each dismissive glance was being weighed and recorded with clinical precision. Richard eventually moved closer, flanked by admirers, exuding an air of casual dominance. He called out to the group nearest Marcus, saying, "Perhaps next time we should hand out a dress code at the door just to avoid confusion." His voice was light, almost joking, but the underlying contempt was unmistakable. A wave of forced laughter swept through the nearby crowd. Marcus met Richard's gaze across the space between them, steady and unblinking. In that unspoken exchange, there was no submission, no anger, only a quiet certainty that unsettled Richard more than he cared to admit. By the time the evening wound down, the division was complete. Marcus had been isolated without anyone ever raising their voice or making a scene. It was the kind of exclusion that left no fingerprints, only bruises invisible to those who inflicted them. Outside, as Marcus stepped into the cool night, the city stretched before him, alive and indifferent. He pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, not against the chill but against the lingering stink of arrogance and cruelty he had left behind. Tonight had given him all the answers he needed. Tonight had shown him who they really were. As Marcus entered, he scanned the seating chart posted discreetly near the entrance. His name was there, tucked in conspicuously at the far end, not among the primary partners or key negotiators, but near the service corridor. It was a clear message without needing a single word. You do not belong among the decision makers. You are peripheral, optional, an afterthought. Marcus showed no reaction as he made his way to the chair itself was slightly smaller, the table settings a little less elaborate, subtle differences only someone paying close attention would notice. He settled in with quiet dignity, his back straight, his face unreadable. Karen Wallace, seated 3 spots away among the senior, they just had a dinner tour off, and immediately turned to whisper to the guest next to her. She made no effort to hide her disdain. One hand fluttered dismissively in Marcus's direction as she said, loudly enough for others nearby to hear, "Seems the help got themselves a seat tonight." A few muffled laughs broke out among her companions. The remark was cruel, lazy, and designed to cut deep without appearing overtly hostile. Marcus ignored the slight as he unfolded his napkin. He glanced around the table, noting how conversations carried on with an ease that excluded him completely. Toasts were raised to future successes, partnerships were solidified with warm handshakes, and he remained an island at the edge, untouched and uninvited. He observed, he listened, and most importantly, he remembered. Midway through the meal, Richard rose from his central seat to deliver a short speech, filled with backhanded gratitude toward the guests for their ongoing loyalty and vision. As he spoke, his gaze swept over the room but carefully avoided landing on Marcus. The omission was intentional and obvious to anyone paying close attention. When the servers brought out the main course, a delicate plate of seared lamb and seasonal vegetables, Marcus received his dish later than everyone else. His server, flustered and apologetic, whispered a rushed, "Sorry sir, wrong section," before hurrying off. It was another small humiliation, another notch in the long, quiet war being waged against his dignity. Across the table, Karen leaned closer to Scott Evans, her voice dripping with sarcasm as she said, "Bet he thought he was going to sit with the adults tonight." Her words floated across the space between them, landing with the softness of a slap. Scott snorted into his wine glass, and others at their end of the table chuckled with restrained amusement. Despite the mounting disrespect, Marcus continued to comport himself with an unwavering calm. He engaged politely with the server, who brought him his late plate. He thanked the busboy, who cleared his salad. In every gesture, he displayed a poise that only deepened the discomfort of those who sought to diminish him. As dessert was served, a molten chocolate cake paired with an artisanal coffee blend, Richard proposed a toast. He praised innovation, resilience, and leadership, extolling the very qualities they had systematically denied Marcus all night. Some part of Marcus might have found the irony amusing if the stakes had not been so consequential. He raised his glass with the rest of them, his expression giving away nothing. Cheers rang out across the room, but none reached the end of the table where Marcus sat. He watched them over the rim of his glass, studied the smiles that did not quite reach their eyes, the stiff postures disguised as relaxation. The night wore on, and as guests began to drift away toward smaller after-parties and whispered side meetings, Marcus remained seated for a moment longer. He placed his napkin carefully atop his plate, smoothed the front of his jacket, and rose with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who understood precisely what had happened and what it meant. As he walked toward the exit, a few eyes followed him, some out of curiosity, others out of the instinctive recognition that they had miscalculated something important. Richard caught Marcus's movement in the corner of his eye, but chose not to acknowledge him. Karen sipped the last of her wine with a satisfied smirk, oblivious to the storm brewing just beyond her narrow field of vision. Marcus approached the entry checkpoint with quiet confidence. He wore another simple but impeccably tailored suit, navy this time, crisp and professional. In his hand, he carried a slim leather folio, looking every bit the important figure he was. Yet as he moved toward the glass doors leading to the VIP conference room, a security guard stepped directly into his path. "Sir, I need to see your invitation," the guard said flatly, voice devoid. Marcus blinked once, taken slightly aback. Around him, white executives flowed freely past the checkpoint, their badges barely glanced at, if at all. Some wore casual blazers and open-all shirts, far less formal than Marcus, yet none were stopped. None were questioned. Without hesitation, Marcus calmly produced his printed invitation from the folio. He handed it over without a word, eyes steady, expression unreadable. The guard scrutinized it far longer than necessary before finally nodding curtly and stepping aside. Marcus continued forward, but the weight of dozens of invisible eyes followed him. Those nearby, some pausing with coffee cups in hand, registered the incident and turned quickly away, pretending not to notice. It was another silent blow, another public question mark placed on his belonging. Inside the main conference hall, the humiliation continued. Karen Wallace was among the first to greet a new arrival, an executive from a potential partner firm. She caught sight of Marcus entering and offered an exaggerated double take, murmuring to Scott Evans just loud enough, "Who let the guests from catering wander up here?" Scott chuckled under his breath, barely concealing his amusement. Marcus, hearing but ignoring the comment, made his way to a seat near the center of the room, unclaimed but ideally positioned. He sat, placed his folio on the table and began reviewing the agenda displayed on the digital screens. Richard entered a few minutes later, surrounded by a small entourage. His gaze swept the room, briefly locking on Marcus with a flicker of annoyance. It was clear he had expected Marcus to remove himself, to feel uncomfortable enough to stay away. His continued presence was an irritation, a reminder of an unspoken challenge. The session began, led by Richard himself. He outlined the vision for Coleman Dynamics' expansion strategy, peppering his speech with bold promises and aggressive timelines. He spoke about resilience, adaptability, and the need for visionary leadership. The irony was thick, yet few dared acknowledge it. Throughout the meeting, Marcus listened intently, occasionally jotting a few notes. He asked no questions, made no comments, but his presence was louder than any speech. His mere existence in that room, after the calculated slights of the past days, unsettled those who prided themselves on their seamless dominance. During a short break, as executives shuffled toward the coffee bar and restroom, another security guard approached Marcus. The man wore a tight, uncomfortable smile as he said, "Sir, this area is reserved for senior leadership only. May I ask your business here?" Marcus looked up slowly, met his eyes without flinching, and answered in a calm, clear voice. "I am exactly where I am supposed to be." The guard hesitated, uncertain, then mumbled an apology and retreated. The exchange had drawn a few stares, but again, no one intervened. No one spoke on Marcus' behalf. Silence was the preferred currency of the privileged. When the break ended and everyone returned to their seats, Marcus noticed subtle shifts. Conversations were quieter, glances were sharper. A few of the more perceptive executives, including Emma Brooks sitting discreetly near the back, sensed that a storm was brewing beneath Marcus's composed exterior. Richard resumed the meeting with renewed energy, but the undercurrent of discomfort remained. Every time his eyes inadvertently crossed paths with Marcus, a thin line of tension flickered across his face. The narrative Richard had constructed, of absolute control and untouchable supremacy, was beginning to fray at the edges. By the session's end, Richard announced a series of partnership negotiations scheduled for the coming weeks, including one particularly anticipated acquisition, rumored to be worth over $1 billion. Cheers and applause filled the room, but Marcus remained silent, his hands folded calmly on the table. As the room emptied, Karen brushed past Marcus with an exaggerated bump of her shoulder, muttering, "Hope you enjoyed your field trip." Marcus did not react. He gathered his materials, straightened his jacket, and exited the room with measured steps. Outside the hall, he paused briefly, allowing himself a long breath. The air beyond those heavy doors was freer, cleaner somehow, as if the building itself had absorbed the bile of unchecked arrogance. The sun had barely climbed to its peak when the Coleman Dynamics Innovation Summit commenced, a grand event held inside the sprawling exhibition hall of the Marlowe. The space had been transformed into a gleaming arena of ambition, with towering digital screens, polished chrome stages, and rows of meticulously arranged seating for hundreds of attendees. Today was not just about internal politics. Today, potential investors, strategic partners, and industry journalists were watching. Every move mattered. Every impression lingered longer. Richard Coleman knew this, and he intended to command the spotlight with his usual flair. His opening remarks crackled over the sound system, booming with charisma and confidence. Attendees leaned forward eagerly, drinking in his promises of growth and transformation. Beneath the bright lights, Richard smiled expansively, playing his part to perfection. As he continued speaking, Richard shifted the energy toward the importance of image and professionalism in leadership, an old theme but one that he twisted now for a sharper purpose. His voice took on a lighter, more mocking tone as he said, "I think today we have a perfect opportunity to demonstrate a key point." His eyes, full of performative warmth, sought out Marcus in the audience. Richard's hand extended outward in a grand invitation. Marcus, seated unobtrusively near the middle, lifted his head. There was a half-second of hesitation, the briefest ripple of discomfort in the room, before Marcus rose and made his way toward the stage. He walked with the same composed, unhurried pace he had maintained all along, even as dozens of curious, amused, or indifferent eyes tracked his every movement. Once on stage, Richard placed a firm hand on Marcus's shoulder, a gesture meant to seem friendly, but executed with the controlling touch of someone positioning a piece on a chessboard. Richard then launched into a lecture on executive presence, gesturing vaguely at Marcus as he spoke about the importance of knowing how to present oneself properly in leadership settings. Without saying it outright, he framed Marcus as the cautionary tale. The laughter was quiet at first, suppressed under the thin veil of politeness, but it grew bolder with every passing second. Somewhere near the front, a group of younger executives exchanged grins. One of them discreetly raised a phone, pretending to check a message, but in reality recording the unfolding humiliation. The camera lens captured the precise moment Richard chuckled and added, "You cannot expect to lead if you look like you just wandered in off the street." The audience reaction was a mix of nervous titters and genuine amusement. Few dared to openly oppose the spectacle, and many convinced themselves it was harmless, a joke among colleagues. But the air was thick with a discomfort that even the oblivious could feel. So neither Southfielder nor Button moved. He neither flinched nor responded. His silence was louder than Richard's entire performance. Finally, after several excruciating minutes, Richard clapped him lightly on the back and dismissed him from the stage with a cheery, "Off you go," leaving Marcus to walk alone back to his seat under the weight of hundreds of stares. As Marcus sat down, a few people nearby averted their eyes, pretending to be engrossed in their notes or devices. Others allowed themselves smirks, subtle but unmistakable. The group who had filmed the exchange began editing the video almost immediately, adding a few lines of mocking text, ready to circulate it privately among the company's internal chats. They found it hilarious, a harmless joke at the expense of someone they deemed irrelevant. Yet there was an uneasiness clinging to the edges of the laughter, a sense that perhaps the spectacle had been just a little too cruel, a little too nakedly petty. But self-interest drowned out conscience, as it so often did in rooms like this. After the summit's main presentation ended, smaller breakout sessions began. Conversations buzzed in the side halls and networking lounges, with the video quietly bouncing from phone to phone. Marcus was aware of the glances, the half-smothered chuckles. He moved through it all like a man walking through a storm he had already prepared for. Every whisper, every snicker, every look was recorded silently within him. He did not retaliate. He did not confront. He simply watched, absorbing everything. Meanwhile, Richard basked in the praise of his peers. Partners clapped him on the back. Investors chuckled at his wit. In their eyes, the minor cruelty was part of the rough-and-tumble game of business. There was no room for hurt feelings at this level, or so they told themselves. Karen Wallace found the video particularly funny, sharing it with Scott Evans under the table during a coffee break. "This is pure gold," she muttered gleefully, shaking her head with mock disbelief. Scott laughed too, replying, He should be thanking us for the attention." Both were too self-assured, too deeply entrenched in their arrogance to notice the subtle tightening in the faces of a few younger attendees who had witnessed everything. The laughter still echoed faintly as Marcus exited the conference hall. The sun outside had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the gleaming marble floors. Without a word, Marcus crossed the lobby, every step measured, every breath deliberate. He refused to carry their ridicule beyond the walls that had birthed it. His hands remained steady at his sides, his face calm, but inside, he was carving each slight into memory with surgical precision. He did not look back. Behind him, the energy in the conference rooms shifted. Those who had participated in the mockery returned to their casual conversations, congratulating themselves on another successful summit, their minds already turning toward the upcoming negotiations and deals they believed were firmly within their grasp. But not everyone was ready to forget what they had witnessed. In the smaller breakout rooms and side lounges, murmured conversations began to stir among the younger attendees. They spoke in low voices, glancing around to ensure they were not overheard. Some of them, fresh from university programs that preached diversity and inclusion, felt a sick churn of betrayal twist in their stomachs. This was not the meritocracy they had been promised. Emma Brooks sat at a small table near the far end of the lounge, her laptop open but forgotten. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating, uncertain. Around her, other interns and junior analysts gathered in cautious clusters. One of them leaned in and whispered, "Did you see the way he looked after they made him stand up there?" Another replied, "They treated him like he was invisible." Or worse, it was not just about clothing, it was about everything. Emma listened, heart pounding. She knew what she had to do. When Marcus had been summoned to the stage, she had instinctively recorded the entire ordeal on her phone, her thumb trembling slightly as she captured the smirks, the patronizing tones, the forced laughter. She had not planned it. It had been pure reflex, a quiet act of preservation in a room where power trampled decency without a second thought. Now, staring at the footage, she realized its significance. It was evidence, unfiltered and undeniable. It was truth that could not be buried beneath polished press releases and hollow apologies. Emma made a decision then, a decision that felt far bigger than her young career, a decision that carried both risk and necessity. In the privacy of a restroom stall, Emma uploaded the video to a secure cloud drive, labeling it plainly, Innovation Summit Recording. She would not send it out yet. Timing mattered. But it would not stay hidden forever. She stepped out into the hallway, straightened her blazer, and rejoined the flow of retreating executives with a heart full of quiet rebellion. She was not alone. Over the next hour, other employees, many still junior enough to have ideals not yet eroded by cynicism, shared their discomfort with each other. They spoke cautiously, testing the waters. Was it just me, or did that feel wrong? I can't believe nobody said anything. It was like watching a bad movie where you know how it ends but you still hope someone will stand up. The seeds of discontent had been sown. Richard and his senior allies, too insulated by years of unchecked authority, remained oblivious. They laughed and drank in the executive lounge, reliving the day's highlights as if nothing had cracked beneath the glossy surface. Karen Wallace showed the video to Scott Evans again, laughing harder the second time. "Did you see his face?" she said, her voice dripping with mockery. Scott added, "He probably thinks this is just how it is at this level. Poor guy." They clinked glasses, sealing their complicity with the casual cruelty that came so easily to those who had never tasted the bitterness of exclusion. Meanwhile, Marcus returned to his hotel room. He placed his folio carefully on the desk, sat in the high-back chair by the window, and looked out over the city's skyline. His phone buzzed softly with a message from his chief legal advisor. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Marcus allowed himself a small breath of satisfaction. They thought they had humiliated him, reduced him to a footnote in their evening of self-congratulation. They had no idea they had exposed themselves instead. Every insult, every dismissal, every cheap laugh had been witnessed. And it had been recorded. Not just by Emma, but by the eyes of every young professional who would remember this moment long after the champagne lost its sparkle. The tides were shifting, invisibly, but inevitably. Power, once assumed to be invulnerable, had begun to fray at the edges. In the days to come, the very tools Richard had used to demean would become the instruments of his undoing. Marcus did not need to fight them with anger. He needed only to let the truth stand where it could be seen. And when that happened, no amount of wealth, no legacy of arrogance would shield them from the consequences they had so carelessly invited upon themselves. Around a wide oak table, the key executives of Coleman Dynamics gathered, lounging back in plush leather chairs as city lights sprawled endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Richard, leaning casually against the bar, recounted the day's events with exaggerated flair, painting himself as the consummate showman who had turned an awkward moment into a lesson for everyone present. He raised his glass and said, "I think we taught everyone a thing or two about standards today." The room erupted in laughter, not polite or restrained, but full-throated and mean-spirited. Karen Wallace nearly choked on her drink from laughing so hard. Scott Evans pounded the table lightly, wheezing. You should have seen his face when you put your hand on his shoulder. Like he wanted to melt into the floor. It was not just mockery. It was celebration. They toasted not just to their imagined victory over Marcus, but to the idea that they remained untouchable, masters of a game only they knew the rules to. Emma Brooks, under the pretense of clearing up some notes, had quietly stayed within earshot. Hidden behind a decorative divider, she recorded parts of the conversation, heart hammering in her chest. She heard Karen quip, "Maybe he is just some consultant they dragged in to look diverse." "That would explain the wardrobe," Scott chimed in. "Bet he does not even have decision-making power. Probably some figurehead." The words were delivered casually, soaked in smug certainty. No one questioned the assumption. No one wondered if perhaps they had misread the situation catastrophically. Richard, emboldened by the camaraderie, leaned forward and added, "Anyway, no harm done. He will go home with a few bruised feelings, and we will go home with the contracts. Everybody wins." More laughter, more clinking glasses. In their world, the appearance of power was all that mattered. Image trumped substance. Dignity was expendable if it served the bottom line. They believed Marcus had been neutralized, filed away into the mental drawer labeled irrelevant. What they did not realize was that their laughter had been premature. Emma quietly slipped away from the lounge before anyone noticed her absence. Her hands trembled slightly as she backed up her recordings to the same secure drive where she had stored the summit footage. She knew she was taking a risk. She also knew that silence, in moments like this, was a form of complicity she could not live with. Downstairs in the quieter, less gilded halls of the Marlowe, a few other employees gathered in hushed circles, exchanging bits and pieces of what they had seen and heard. A sense of unease thickened among them. Some had family members who had fought battles against injustice in quieter decades past. Some had simply believed, perhaps naively, that corporate America had moved beyond such casual cruelty. Now they saw the truth etched in the smirks and jokes of their leaders. Back upstairs, Richard poured another round, unaware that the seeds of his downfall had already taken root. As the laughter died down and the meeting wound to a close, he made a final toast, "To knowing your place and keeping it." The words hung heavily in the air, a final, careless arrogance. No one protested, no one corrected him. They merely raised their glasses, sealing their fate in crystal and gold. When Marcus received word of the meeting's contents later that night through a secure message, he allowed himself no outward reaction. He had expected cruelty. He had expected pettiness. What he had not expected was how eager they were to document their own malice, how gleefully they laid bare their contempt. Every step they took to diminish him only tightened the noose they had unknowingly fashioned for themselves. Marcus turned away from the window, the city's reflection fading into darkness behind him. He sat at the sleek hotel desk, opened his laptop, and began drafting a brief memo to his board of directors. The title was simple: Coleman Dynamics Partnership Evaluation Update. The body was even simpler: immediate suspension recommended pending further review. Attached were files labeled Innovation Summit Incident and Internal Executive Conduct Recording. No dramatics, no embellishment, just truth. In the language that mattered most in corporate warfare: documentation, evidence, undeniable reality. Major tech outlets, business journals, and even mainstream media stations interrupted their usual broadcasts with a breaking headline that would send shockwaves across industries. Vexora Tech's pending acquisition deal with Coleman Dynamics, valued at approximately $1.5 billion, was now officially revelations regarding Coleman Dynamics' executive culture. At the center of the headlines, however, was not Richard Coleman. It was Marcus Reed. His name blazed across the screens with a clarity that demanded attention. Nextdoor CEO observes partner company in Disgazette before acquisition collapse. The captions declared boldly. Photos of Marcus began circulating online, side by side with lists of his achievements, awards, and keynote addresses at global tech conferences. Within an hour, the videos Emma Brooks had saved found their way into the hands of reputable journalists. Short, damning clips stitched together with stark simplicity showed the mockery, the disdain, the unvarnished arrogance of Coleman Dynamics' leadership. The footage needed no commentary. It spoke volumes all on its own. News anchors detailed how Marcus had attended the Coleman events in a deliberate undergoer capacity to evaluate the company culture firsthand. Experts weighed in, noting that due diligence no longer merely involved combing through financials, but also assisting whether a company's internal values aligned with broader market expectations for ethics and inclusivity. As the news gained momentum, hashtags exploded across social media. Corporate responsibility, diversity in tech, accountability now, all began trending alongside Marcus Reed's name. Back at the Marlow, word spread like wildfire through the lingering remnants of the summit crowd. Phones buzzed, faces paled, and clusters of executives huddled in tight circles, whispering in panic. Karen Wallace, who had so confidently dismissed Marcus as a nobody, sat frozen, reading the news on her device. Her fingers hovered uselessly above the screen as her mind raced through the... Scott Evans, who had been reveling in cruel jokes only hours earlier, muttered under his breath, oh no, over and over again as he absorbed the reality of their catastrophic mistake. Upstairs, Richard Coleman sat alone in the lounge, nursing a drink that suddenly tasted bitter. His phone vibrated incessantly on the table, but he ignored it, staring out into the dark cityscape. The words, Nexora withdrawal letter flashed briefly across the screen before the notifications piled on top of. In less than 2 hours, Marcus Reed had dismantled years of Richard's empire, building efforts without raising his voice or lifting a single visible weapon. He had simply let the truth stand where everyone could see it, stark and undeniable. The very arrogance that led Richard to humiliate Marcus had now become the noose tightening around his own neck. Marcus, meanwhile, remained composed. He spent the evening not at celebratory dinners or public interviews, but in the quiet of his hotel suite, finalizing statements with his communications team. His response would be measured, professional, devastating. We thank Coleman Dynamics for their interest, but, after a comprehensive review of internal culture and values, we have decided to pursue alternative strategic partnerships more aligned with our vision, the draft read. When morning came, the financial fallout began. Coleman Dynamics' stock plunged almost immediately upon opening bell, erasing hundreds of millions in shareholder value within the first hour. Board members scrambled to convene emergency meetings. External investors issued statements of concern. Analysts predicted that Coleman Dynamics would struggle to survive the reputational damage, let alone secure another deal of such magnitude anytime soon. Marcus watched these developments from a distance, his demeanor unchanged. It had never been about revenge for him. It had always been about principles, about drawing a clear and irreversible line between what was acceptable and what was not. The article, backed by undeniable footage and corroborated witness accounts, detailed the systemic arrogance, casual racism, and toxic leadership culture festering within the once venerated firm. Emma Brooks had sent the files anonymously through encrypted channels, her identity carefully shielded, but the evidence itself roared louder than any name ever could. Attached to the article were embedded videos, including the humiliating stage incident and the recorded private meeting where Richard and his team ridiculed Marcus and celebrated their cruelty. TechSphere Weekly did not hold back. Analysts quoted within the piece dissected the leadership's behavior, pointing out how such deep-seated biases were not isolated acts but symptoms of a broader, deeply flawed culture. Social media platforms caught fire within hours. Influential thought leaders, diversity advocates, and business ethics scholars reposted the story, amplifying its reach. Hashtags like Accountability Matters and Boycott Coleman began trending globally. Even major news networks picked up the story, airing snippets of the footage during primetime broadcasts. Commentators shook their heads in disbelief. Investors and industry veterans called it a cautionary tale of unchecked hubris, A notable anchor on a morning financial show summarized it bluntly. This is not just a PR disaster. This is corporate self-destruction in real time. Inside Coleman Dynamics headquarters, panic ruled the day. PR teams scrambled to draft apologies. Legal teams huddled behind closed doors, desperately seeking strategies to contain the damage. Richard Coleman issued a terse internal memo claiming the company was reviewing its practices and remained committed to diversity and inclusion. But the words rang hollow in the face of the stark visual evidence now seared into public consciousness. Employees, once proud to wear the Coleman badge, found themselves fielding uncomfortable questions from family, friends, and professional contacts. Some began resigning quietly, not willing to have their names tied to a sinking ship. Richard attempted damage control by scheduling a live press conference to address the issue. Cameras clicked furiously as he took the stage, looking paler than usual, sweat glinting under the harsh lights. His speech was a fumbling mess of half apologies and hollow promises. He insisted that what happened did not represent the company's true values, that steps were already being taken to address concerns. But when a reporter shouted, "What do you have to say about mocking the CEO of the company you were supposed to acquire?" Richard faltered. His prepared remarks stumbled into awkward silence. The clip of that exact moment was clipped and shared within minutes. The image of Richard, mouth half open, eyes darting desperately for help, became the definitive symbol of his collapse. Outside the company's headquarters, protesters began gathering, holding signs that read, "Leadership is accountability and justice for Marcus." Former employees, emboldened by the exposure, stepped forward with their own accounts of discrimination and toxic culture inside the walls of Coleman Dynamics. Whistleblower reports multiplied. A growing number of partner companies began publicly distancing themselves. Statements flowed onto official websites and social feeds. "We are suspending all collaboration with Coleman Dynamics pending further review. We stand firmly against all forms of discrimination." One after another, alliances unraveled, contracts were revoked, partnerships severed. As the chaos spiraled, Emma Brooks watched from a distance, heart pounding but steady. She had taken a risk, one that could have ended her career before it even began. But now, seeing the truth reach the light, she felt a quiet pride. Her small act had triggered a reckoning long overdue. Meanwhile, Marcus Reed remained silent in public, his name attached only to professionalism and restraint. He understood that the true blow had already been delivered. No angry speeches, no aggressive counterattacks, only patience and the relentless exposure of the truth. Across the nation, editorial pieces reflected on the broader implications. They spoke about systemic bias, about the myth of meritocracy, about the urgent need for cultural change in corporate America. Universities cited the unfolding events as case studies. Activists rallied behind the moment as evidence that even the seemingly untouchable could be brought down by collective courage and quiet integrity. The atmosphere inside the executive conference room was tense, suffocating even, as shareholders, legal advisors, and key decision-makers crammed into the space, their faces grim and drawn. Overnight, the company's stock had plummeted by more than 40%, wiping out billions in market value and sending shockwaves through investment circles demanding out bounty. In hushed, urgent tones, Richard Coleman tried to rally the room, insisting that the storm could be weathered with aggressive PR and swift policy reforms. "We can manage this," he said, his voice brittle with desperation. "We just need to get ahead of the narrative." But no one nodded. No one spoke. The weight of the evidence, the sheer magnitude of public outrage, had rendered his words hollow. The board chair, an austere figure named Eleanor Gratt, cleared her throat and addressed the room with measured gravity. "This is no longer a matter of damage control," she said. "This is a matter of survival." A vote was called without further debate. The resolution was simple and brutal. Immediate termination of Richard Coleman as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately, pending formal ratification by the full board, within 24 hours. When the hands were counted, the decision was unanimous. Richard sat frozen in his seat, disbelief etched across his face. For years, he had ruled Coleman Dynamics like a monarch, his authority unquestioned. Now, with a single vote, he was dethroned, stripped of the very power he had so often abused. No Oz-weather quotes, no farewell speeches were given. His legacy collapsed under the weight of his own arrogance, silent and final. News of Richard's removal broke within minutes, spreading like wildfire across media channels already primed for scandal. Business analysts dissected the downfall with clinical precision. They pointed to the cultural rot exposed by Marcus Reed's quiet investigation. They highlighted the catastrophic failure of leadership, the blind entitlement, the disregard for basic human dignity. The company's stock continued to nosedive, crossing critical thresholds that triggered automatic sell-offs by major funds. Some investors, eager to protect what little remained, issued public statements condemning the behavior of Coleman Dynamics leadership and severing all financial ties. "We cannot in good conscience support an organization whose values so starkly conflict with our own," read one statement from a prominent institutional investor. Another simply said, "We are out." Inside the company, chaos reigned. Department heads scrambled to update business continuity plans. Legal teams prepared for an avalanche of lawsuits, both from wronged employees and enraged shareholders. HR departments received a flood of resignation letters, each carrying the same underlying message: "We refuse to be associated with this." Meanwhile, protesters outside the company headquarters grew in number and intensity, their chants echoing through the concrete canyons of the financial district. The sight of banners reading "Leadership is earned, not inherited, and accountability is not optional" filled the news broadcasts. Helicopter footage showed the growing crowd, a living testament to the public's outrage and the company's vanishing credibility. Richard packed his belongings under the cold gaze of two corporate security officers assigned to oversee his departure. His office, once a symbol of his unassailable power, now felt like a tomb. He gathered framed photographs, scattered awards, a few personal effects, placing them carefully into a cardboard box. As he turned for one last look, the silence weighed heavier than any jeer or insult could have. No one came to bid him farewell. No loyalists rallied at his side. He walked out of Coleman Dynamics a relic, a cautionary tale, a warning etched into the annals of corporate history. The aftermath of Richard Coleman's fall extended far beyond the walls of his former empire. Stripped of his titles, fortune significantly diminished, and reputation shattered, Richard faced a life stripped bare of the illusions that had once shielded him. For weeks, he vanished from the public eye, retreating into the anonymity of small towns and second-rate hotels, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what he had lost. Pride had kept him silent at first, but pride was a fragile armor when the world no longer cared enough to hate you. Eventually, desperation gave way to reflection, and reflection to action. Richard enrolled quietly in diversity and inclusion workshops, his face mostly hidden under caps and sunglasses, listening to speakers who once would have been invisible to him. At first, the words sounded foreign, but as he listened, he began to understand the truth he had been too arrogant to see. He was not the victim. He had been the architect of his own undoing. Months later, Richard reappeared in public, not behind a podium or a desk, but in community centers and nonprofits events focused on social equity. He did not seek press coverage. He volunteered, to listen, to learn, to help without leading. At a conference on workplace justice, he took the microphone during a Q&A session and said, "I was wrong. My failure was not just in what I did, but in what I allowed, encouraged, and celebrated. My apology is not enough. Change must be the apology." The room fell silence, not in awe, but in cautious acknowledgement. Some forgave, many did not. That was not his to control. Richard understood that now. Redemption, if it came, would be earned in increments, not awarded in applause. Meanwhile, Karen Wallace and Scott Evans faced their own reckonings. Fired shortly after the exposé, blacklisted quietly by an industry now hyper-aware of public scrutiny, both struggled to find footing in a world that no longer tolerated their brand of casual cruelty. At first, they raged against it. Karen blamed cancel culture, Scott blamed Marcus, but blame could not pay rent or restore credibility. Eventually, reality forced humility. Karen found herself working with a small local nonprofit that provided technology training for underprivileged youth. At first, it was just a paycheck. Then, slowly, as she watched young people fight battles she had once mocked from ivory towers, something shifted. One evening, after a long day of mentoring, she sat alone in the empty classroom and whispered to herself, "Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I was part of the problem." She started arriving early, staying late, advocating fiercely for students she once would have overlooked. She never sought public redemption. She simply worked, day by day, to be better than she had been. Scott, after months of rejections and failed interviews, volunteered at a community center focused on employment readiness for marginalized adults. He taught resume workshops, helped with interview preparation, and in doing so came face to face with stories of perseverance and dignity he had never understood before. Listening to a veteran explain how hard it was to re-enter the workforce after homelessness, Scott felt a deep, aching shame bloom inside him. He realized then that success was not about stepping on others. True leadership meant lifting others even when no one was watching. Slowly, clumsily, he began to rebuild himself, not in the image of who he had been, but of who he wished he had been all along. As for Marcus Reed, he moved forward without fanfare. Nexora Tech thrived, forging partnerships with companies whose values aligned with integrity and respect. Marcus remained as steady and composed in victory as he had been in adversity. When asked in an interview about the Coleman Dynamics scandal, he simply said, "True character reveals itself when no one is watching. We must choose who we are every day. No headlines, no vengeance, just quiet, unshakable conviction." In the end, justice had not come through grand gestures or violent reversals. It had come through exposure, consequence, and the difficult, necessary work of change. Not everyone who fell would rise again. But for those who chose to confront their failings with honesty and courage, a different kind of redemption was still possible. The end. If you found yourself holding your breath during this story, take a moment to hit the like button. It helps more people discover powerful stories like this. And if you want to see more real moments where dignity wins over arrogance, make sure you subscribe so you never miss an upload. I would love to hear what you think about the twists in this story. Was there a moment that caught you off guard, or made you stop and think? Let me know down in the comments. Also, tell me where you are watching from. It is always amazing to see how far these stories travel.